Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with Chicago-based jazz pianist, composer, and scientist Roland Tempelaar. He talked about his debut 2021 CD, New York Chapter, recounting the years he spent living in the Big Apple. While he mastered the art of balancing science and music for much of his life, this especially held true throughout the New York years. This was a time when he spent the days researching quantum chemistry at Columbia University as he played in the downtown clubs of the night. He's originally from the Netherlands and started his classical piano training at 6 before discovering jazz in his teens, and he has never looked back. Enjoy the story.
I'm good. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. Hey, thanks for taking a minute out. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So let's talk about your latest CD. And I want to know, it's coming out during, the pandemic that's still going on, been limited access to fans and live shows. What does this album release mean to you?
Right, yeah, that's a very good question. And I'm probably not the first guest on your show telling that, this had a long time coming. We recorded it in the fall of 2019, right? And so the original plan was to release it in spring of 2020, but then it seemed like the whole world was falling apart. I had the opportunity, quote unquote, to just push it back as long as I wanted, essentially. There was really no rush in getting this out other than me just being excited to have it out, and to present it to the outside world. Finally, I guess around half a year ago, I figured, it really seems like I'm ready to release it. I think the way things are looking, the level of optimism that I can see in the world is as such that I think this is a great time to step up and release the record. And so for me, it means a lot to release it because it's so entangled with the course of affairs over the last 2 years. And I sort of hope to chime in with this on the level of enthusiasm or optimism that I sense is there. Of course, there are still uncertainties, but I think that the path forward is sort of there, and hopefully we'll get there.
Entitled New York Chapter, it's your debut. You're originally from the Netherlands. Is this almost kind of a love letter to New York, or kind of just a real reflective piece on where you've come from and where you are now?
I think both a little bit. So this was really, the idea for the album came after a while when I was living in New York. I've always known that my years in New York were limited, which had, there was a certain boundary effect there. So it was a transient experience for me to be in New York. At some point, it dawned on me that it would be so appropriate to make an album that is really reflective of these years that I lived there and these years that I played music there. At the same time, it's definitely a love letter because, I think there are two kinds of people that love New York and people that hate New York, and there's very little in between, and I'm definitely in the first category here. So a love letter for sure.
What do you hope the listener gets from this? Those that download or buy this, what do you ultimately want them to get from this album?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And to be honest, it's been a little bit of a fluid thing for myself, even what I get out of the album. I think the original motivation was that it was just so appropriate to make an album because things were aligned in such a way that, it was sort of perfect. And I knew that after leaving New York, I would go into a new phase and things would be sort of shaken up to the point that it would have been, much more complicated, I guess, to do it. So originally it was really that I figured, okay, this is the best time I could ever have to do it. For me, I've had 2 years essentially, right, to listen to the album essentially, while nobody was really aware of it being in the making, so to speak. And I think the meaning of the album has changed for myself quite a bit. It's really become a connection for me with a previous, stage in my life where I was when I lived in New York. At the same time, I think it's also very reflective of what New York is about. At least, this is a very personal thing, but maybe some people can relate to it. Just in the way the album is constructed. first of all, the lineup of songs that we play on this album were really the songs that I ended up playing a lot while performing in New York. So they sort of grew with me into the sort of core repertoire of much of what I was doing. At the same time, one of the things that I found really striking about New York is that the way jazz musicians make music there and the way they interact with each other, it was very different from what I experienced in previous places where I lived, in that there is a lot in New York happening on the bandstand. At least to me, there was relatively little in terms of rehearsing or forming bands and things like that. So you would really meet each other and get to know each other on the stage while performing. That required a certain way of playing together where you had to walk into each other and tune into each other quite rapidly. You needed to be really open to new characters. And so that was good for as much as there was, to me, always a certain freshness to the music that was being played, in my own performances, but especially also in performances that I've seen by other people. In a way, the way the album is constructed is actually very similar, that the album was not super rehearsed. It was a very spontaneous event where I got together with Miles Loneker, who was playing the bass, and Piers Van Nostrand on drums. And, we sort of set some boundary conditions, but other than that, the playing it by itself is really about trying to be as open as possible and listen closely to what the other is doing and let the music essentially evolve in the moment. And again, that for me has been very, synonymous to the experiences in New York, where you do that all the time on the bandstand. That is really what I hope to convey with the album for the listener, that they can sort of appreciate the freshness that's going on, really the in the moment kind of thing, not so much the rehearsed aspect of it, because that's to some extent very slim here, but instead it's very much about sort of the spontaneous, in the moment improvisation, the kind of thing. So that's something that I kind of realized only when listening after the recording and appreciating all the things that happened during the recording that I couldn't have predicted beforehand. And these are the things that I hope the listener can appreciate and take home from it and maybe be inspired by.
So you're originally from the Netherlands. Talk to me a little bit about how jazz became your life and you became the professional you are now.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I should mention that jazz has always been only part of my life, actually, because at daytime I've been pursuing an academic career. And that was also the reason I was moving away from New York, because of sort of job opportunities. And so it's always sort of coexisted alongside science, which, was a major commitment. I started playing around age 6, and I have to believe my parents there because I don't really remember, those really early years, but that's really, ever since, it's been a part of my life, and I've been playing every day virtually since that very moment. So jazz actually only came along later. I started with classical music. I was classically trained. But at some point in my teenage years, I discovered jazz, and this is probably something that many people can relate to. Once I discovered jazz, coming from classical music, I was like, wow, I cannot turn back, right? I need to play this kind of music. It provides me a level of freedom that I really want to pursue. So ever since, been pursuing exactly that, trying to learn the concepts of jazz and the way it's being played and try to internalize all of that. Ultimately, with the goal actually to hopefully inspire people the way I've been inspired by other players. So really sort of passing on the message, if you will. That has grown into what essentially my life has been about for the most part, especially the combination of doing scientific research at daytime, which was my day job, and then turning into a jazz player, around 7 p.m. and trying to pursue that and trying to balance these two disciplines.
what I kind of wanted to piggyback off of, it's very interesting. It's very rare that, I mean, musicians have different interdisciplinary interests, different jobs. They moonlight as different things. But how does the science and the music come together for you to enhance both, to make both a more enriching experience for you?
Right, yeah, so they complement each other really well, in part because they're very similar and they're also very different in certain ways. So the similarity is in, especially science and jazz is a lot about creativity and improvisation. And so I would argue you use many of the same intellectual tools to do both activities. So in that sense, I find myself very much at home in scientific research. I guess in part because I find myself very much at home in playing jazz and improvising and vice versa. And actually, you'd be amazed by how many scientists actually are musicians first of all, but especially jazz musicians. This is something that is actually not as rare as you may think. But at the same time, they're also complementary to each other in a way that really suited me very well. And in particular, especially fundamental scientific research is important and has been tremendously important for society. But the fruits that come out of your work are, will see the light of the day, or at least make it into society way, way down the road. And so it can sometimes feel somewhat, secular maybe, to really spend much of your day doing fundamental research. And with music, it's sort of almost the opposite. If you play a concert, if you have a performance, or if you release an album for that matter, you get almost instant response. But actually in performing, it is actually mostly about instant response, where you have a conversation with other musicians and the audience and so on. For me, that really, I think, helped a lot to sort of balance, I guess, the desire to see results immediately and also be able to essentially work on things that are seeing results way, way down the road.
So what was the first live jazz show you saw that really blew you away and made you think that's something you would want to do?
That's a very, very good question. I got to say that when I started listening to jazz, I was blown away by everything. I didn't grow up in a household where, let's say, it was all like Blue Note records or like Kind of Blue, or these sort of seminal records. Instead, the exposure I had to jazz was kind of accidental and random, and these could be from budget compilation CDs, and essentially everything I would get in terms of jazz, I would be blown away by. So it had such a tremendous impact. So the first shows I ever witnessed were really the shows that did it. I guess one of the things that really was super important for me to really embrace jazz as something that is, not just a fling, but really something that is a substantial part of what I'm interested in, and also having that experience that it's a passion that's shared by so many other people, is when I first attended the North Sea Jazz Festival, which was actually still in The Hague. It has now moved to Rotterdam ever since. And that was really, the experience, especially as a teenager, where you got to see so many great people all in the same day. So that really stood out and has ever since stood out to me as like a decisive moment that built upon the earlier experiences, even in really cementing my passion for this music.
So over this year and a half that we've been away from live music and things have been kind of turned upside down, we all learned things because we had more time with ourselves and it was self-reflective. What did you learn about yourself that maybe you didn't realize before that's going to make you stronger as we all kind of reemerge into life and onto the stage again?
I learned a lot for sure. And for me, the transition, from 2019 to 2020, right around the time that we recorded the album, was a pretty dramatic one in some sense. In a good way. I started a job here at Northwestern University, and so that was really the reason that I moved out of New York into the Chicago area. But also, we just had a daughter, which was born in the summer of 2019. And so I was also transitioning into fatherhood. So that's a major transition, obviously. And then on top of that, of course, the pandemic hit. And so that's been, well, quite a change for everybody, essentially. And so all these things sort of coincided with each other. And so to say I learned a lot is maybe an understatement. It's been quite a change in many, many aspects. We spent actually a good amount of time with the daughter at home because, daycare was closed and things like that. So I got to spend a lot of time with the family. And in many ways, the life that I was living about a year ago has been the most extreme contrast with that life that I had in New York before that. And so you have to sort of reinvent yourself in many ways and also find new ways, I guess, to get satisfaction out of things. And there are many opportunities, right? So it's been a very positive experience in that sense. Right now, there's this sort of transition, at least as I witness it, back to normalcy, at least for as much as the pandemic is concerned. And so for me, the goals now is to kind of combine these new experiences with the experiences I've previously had in order to really move on to a very exciting number of years ahead.
What do you like the best about being a professional musician? I mean, you obviously have other things going on in life, but as far as like creating jazz, what motivates you? What brings you so much joy in doing this?
It's really, I think, sharing the passion of jazz with other people. I think, to me, jazz and music in general is very much a social thing. I enjoy playing, any time of the day, also for myself to practice and things like that. But once music starts to breathe, and reach other people, I think that's really what drives me in doing it in some sense. The experience of sharing music and getting something back from the audience, some sort of, you're establishing a connection in some sense, which is a two-way road. That experience is just priceless. And so that has always motivated me to do this. So it's a very primal, almost irrational thing that drives me into making music and doing that professionally. And I guess that's something that may sound familiar to many other players.
So everyone has a perception or an idea of who they think you are, your family, your friends, your fans, but ultimately you live your life. Who do you think you are?
Oh man, that's a good one. It's a fluid concept in some sense. To sort of answer it in a very deep sense, I'm not always sure what the answer is actually, but to some extent, I tend to identify myself with whatever I'm doing at that very moment. And this holds for, doing research or teaching a class in quantum mechanics or releasing an album and sort of putting out that product and being passionate about that. And so I maybe tend not to overthink too much, the question, who am I in that sense, but really try to, I guess, make that question for myself digestible by focusing on certain things that I have going on at that moment and trying to do that as good as I can.
Right on. Roland, thank you for opening up. Good luck with the album and the return to the stage. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview. We give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Chicago, New York, the Netherlands, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. Thanks to Roland for his time, music, and stories. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Davino in the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com. And for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, Enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.